Welcome to the Reparadigmed Podcast. We're excited to have with us today Dr. George Kalantzis. Doctor, how are you doing today?
I'm doing okay, thank you.
Dr. Kalantzis is the professor of theology at Wheaton College and the director of the Wheaton Center for Early Christian Studies. He's the author of Caesar and the Lamb, Early Christian Attitudes on War and Military Service. He's also written Christian Political Witness with Gregory Lee and Come Let Us Eat Together with Mark Cortez. Dr. Kalantzis, you've done a lot of work on kind of early Christianity, especially with attitudes towards military service. What got you interested in this field?
My work is in the field called patristics, which is the period that we call early Christianity. Patristics means the period of the fathers, the church fathers. My academic work primarily is in Christology and Trinity in the 4th and 5th centuries, the development of doctrine in the 4th and 5th centuries. But my graduate work was in classics. So Greco-Roman, primarily Roman history, philosophy, society, culture, etc. And what got me interested in the topic of the relationship between Christianity and the world around them was that I was seeing a disjoint between those who did New Testament studies and classics department, Roman history, Roman philosophy, Roman culture in a classics department in the university. And for some reason, the two were not able to come together. And being a Christian who studies Christianity or the development of the early church in a classics department attracted my attention. I was trying to figure out how do we actually see the world, both as academics, but also as practitioners.
If you were to summarize, what do you think the benefits of being able to study Christianity as well as the large world around it, what benefits does that provide for those of us who are seeking to understand the Bible?
Think of the scriptures. Think about Jesus and the apostles and the New Testament and Paul. Paul or Peter or the disciples go out from a completely Jewish or primarily Jewish environment into a world that uses words differently, concepts differently. For example, Christians proclaim from early on Jesus, the historical person of Jesus, to be Lord and God, Dominus et Deus. Well, that's also a title for Caesar. Caesar has the emperor and the whole family that is ruling at the time, the Julio-Claudians, have taken on that title, Dominus and Deus, for 60 years before Jesus is recognized to be so. So when Christians speak about Jesus is Lord and a Roman speaks Caesar is Lord, what are we talking about? Are we thinking about the same thing? And actually, that discussion was very much at the core of the message, because Christians would claim Jesus as Lord, Jesus is Lord, which has a corollary. Therefore, Caesar is not Lord. And everyone understood it. And we have to remember that Christians were persecuted early on when they were persecuted. They were persecuted not on religious basis and for religious reasons. Romans didn't care if it was Zeus in your heart or Jesus in your heart, right? They were persecuted for political reasons because they were claiming a different Caesar, a different authority and sovereignty other than the emperor.
So do you think that language that the early church picked, was that intentional?
Both. Think of the Gospel of John written at the very end of the 1st century. The writer begins with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, right? Anarchino logos. Anarchino logos, and in the beginning was the Word, our English translation, is something that rings in our ears, and we don't understand how common that saying was in the time. Because the word that we translate as word, capital W, logos, we get logic from that, logical logic, can also mean reason. Mm-hmm. So a Greek who hears the prologue of John hears at the foundation is reason, which is a common sentiment. And what do Christians do? They take the language that surrounds them, they adopt it, and then they adapt it for their own purposes. They don't invent a new language. They use the language that has been given to them, in which they find themselves, and use it to redefine. And John continues, and the Word became flesh, and his name is Jesus. So he takes the concept, he takes the language, changes its meaning to mean Jesus. Same thing with the rest of the worship. Christians worship Jesus. Pliny the Younger says they pray to Jesus as if to a god. And he says that in 111, in letter 96 to the Emperor Trajan. So Christians take the practices, adapt them for their own purposes, give them new meaning, and concentrate on Jesus as the center of that meaning and those practices.
Kind of getting to Caesar and the Lamb here, one of the things you outline in this book for the early Christian church, especially in the writings specifically, that they pretty unanimously reject military participation in the Roman Empire. What does this have to do with Jesus, and why do you think this was such a key belief for early Christians?
Yeah. So when we think about military service, religion, armies, war, etc., and that's where having a training, or at least being in discussions with classicists who don't actually have a dog in the fight, is very important. Everyone who has studied Roman history knows that, and culture, right? It understands that the Roman world is a sacralized world, which is a concept that is somewhat foreign to us unless we start thinking more deeply about other parts of contemporary world where religion, the relationship with the gods or God, is far more profound than it is in secular and post-secular Western Europe and North America, where everything is described, defined, superseded, supervised, etc., by God, the gods, the divine spirits, all that. So there's one world that is superintended by divine presence.
So anything that's religious is political, and anything that's political is religious.
Exactly. Even think about medieval or even claims of royalty and sovereignty, right? Where does that sovereignty come from? From a divine connection. For the Roman world, it's the same thing. The military is a very religious organization, like every other organization in the Roman world. For example, a Roman soldier enters the military with an oath of allegiance. For us, that oath of allegiance is to the Constitution, which is an idea which is enshrined in a document or a series of documents. For the Romans, the oath they took, it was called a sacramentum, if that rings bells of sacrament. Mm-hmm. It's supposed to. It's under the auspices of the god. So the god of war is Mars. So in English we lose it, but in the Latin languages, Mardi, right? Tuesday is the date of Mars. So the military, entering into the military would be on a Tuesday, the day of Mars. One takes an oath under the authority, under the supervision of the god or the gods, to be loyal to the instruments of the gods, namely the state. So that sacralizing of everything in their experience makes the military a very religious organization. Each cohort, each legion would have its protecting deities. The soldiers within the cohort would offer sacrifices multiple times a year to the gods, including the emperor as a god. So it's a very, very religious environment. Military campaigns do not start without offering sacrifices.
So the early Christians saw military participation in the Roman Empire as compromising their allegiance to King Jesus, because their participation in this other institution is deeply religious, is demonstrating your allegiance to another claim, another king claim.
Yes. So the mistake sometimes we make is we make participation in the military or war or killing, etc., about the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill. Well, that, of course, is part of the discussion, but it's not the first part of the discussion. The first part of the discussion is, who is your Lord? To whom do you owe allegiance? Is it to Jesus? Because if you say Jesus is Lord, then how are you going to say Caesar is Lord? That divided loyalty that doesn't exist. Remember that Jesus is killed claiming to be King of the Jews.
So was that their only or maybe their primary objection to Roman military service, just that it required participation in another religion?
It's participation in a structure, in a worldview, in a construct that is other than the one ordained by God.
So that whole system of ritual and loyalty that makes up that whole military world, really, for whoever enters into it, they saw that as following Jesus should be exclusive of any participation in that system.
That's right. Because if I claim loyalty and allegiance to King Jesus, right, if I'm born into his family, then Caesar has no claim on me. But it's also the counterfactual, where the factual is social order. And we see that in the letter to Diognetus, early second century letter, open letter of apology, that says Christians live their lives, even though they happen to be born in every part of the empire, live their life very differently. They take care of the poor, they take care of the widows, they take care of the orphans, they take care of the hungry, and they clothe the naked. They repay evil with kindness, etc., etc. In other words, Christians understood that they were a counter culture, a counter narrative, a counter environment to the dominant structures around them.
Given that Christians had this kind of nonviolent approach and didn't seem to have any desire to rebel violently against Rome, what was it that made Christianity seem like a threat to some Roman emperors, to the point where they performed this, persecution of the early church?
Now, first we have to realize that the Romans are not in the business of making martyrs. They don't want to do that. Martyrs have a lot of power.
It's bad for business.
Bad for business in the imagination. So when we think of persecution, they're very rare, at least for the first 250 years. Very, very rare. They're sporadic, they're localized. We have the accounts of those persecutions, and therefore they have entered into our imagination as examples. But they're not that many, right? So let's not make it every day of the week somebody was being killed for being a Christian.
Persecution of the Christians was not ubiquitous in the first 250 years of church history.
That's right. The first global or empire-wide persecution is with Decius, the Emperor Decius, in the middle of the 3rd century, 249. And that was not specifically targeting Christians. It was a universal demand of allegiance. So he demanded a sacrifice as an oath of allegiance. And those who refused, Christian or otherwise, were punished. But there are many, many, many local instantiations of those persecutions, right? We have Stephen, the proto-martyr, right, in the Gospels. We have the stories of the apostles, Peter and Paul and others who are executed. John is exiled. We have the martyrdom of Polycarp in the 2nd century. We have Ignatius and Justin Martyr, right? His family name is not Martyr. He was martyred. We have a number of recognizable groups. We have the Martyrs of Lyon in 177, and the Martyrdom Perpetua and Felicity in North Africa in 203. What is it that turned the empire against them? It was fundamentally 5 accusations. The first accusation was disloyalty, because Christians could not affirm, can we call it a pledge of allegiance or an oath of allegiance to Caesar? That's what they're called, right? Every Caesar, every emperor demands loyalty. And the way that Romans demanded that loyalty is by offering sacrifices on behalf of the emperors, right? But it was to the emperors, but on behalf of the emperor. And Christians go, no, we cannot do that because those sacrifices are to deities that do not exist. Best case scenario, they're demons, worst case scenario. So we cannot do that. Well, if you cannot do that, if you cannot pledge allegiance by means of sacrifice, by definition, you are seditious. So the first accusation is sedition. The second accusation is misanthropia, or hatred of humanity. Why? Because Roman society and religion are communal. So we, not I, we offer sacrifices to the gods at their appointed time in the appointed means, so that the gods may show favor on us.
So it was almost seen as an act of violence that the Christians wouldn't sacrifice to the gods, endangering the whole community around them, because now the whole community might face the wrath of the gods.
Maybe the gods will say no because, we've got these Christians in our midst who aren't participating the way they're supposed to.
Exactly. And we have an example of that in the late 3rd century when Emperor Diocletian, there are a lot of Christians by his time, many of them in the court with his entourage, is trying to offer a sacrifice, which is the custom before a military campaign. And the augurs, who are the priests who read the entrails of animals, do the sacrifice. And for the first time, they turn to the emperor and go, "We cannot read these." And everybody panics, right? and they go, "Do it again." So they do it a second time, and we cannot read these. So everybody's in absolute panic. And somebody notices that there are Christians in the rooms who are crossing themselves as the sacrifices are happening. So now what do you do? But that's the thing. That's exactly the idea, right? So the gods are going to come against us because these Christians have abandoned the religion of our ancestors. Of course, the other accusations against Christians are more fantastical, incest, right? Brothers and sisters marry one another.
Cannibalism.
You eat the flesh and blood, right? And the last one is atheism. You deny the existence of the God. And that's the funny part. The funny part is that the Romans are very tolerant. They're extremely tolerant. Their empire is from Scotland to the cataracts of Egypt, right? Very tolerant of anything, except intolerance.
Okay. So they would have been happy if Christians had said, "This is all we need to do," just to add Jesus to the pantheon and just kind of absorb it. But the fact that they said, no, the fact that we can now only worship Jesus was viewed as antithetical to their religious practices.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it, right? Rome rose from nothing in the 8th century BC. 7 little villages on the 7 little hills around the swamp. And in the next 1,000 years, they have conquered the known world. The greatest empire the world has ever seen. Who did that? Who made that possible? If not the gods. So, and you guys now come and tell us they don't exist.
And now the entrails aren't working. Like, obviously it's your fault.
That's exactly it.
So we see this pre-Constantinian Christianity tends to see themselves or see Christianity as very much an alternative system demanding allegiance that's contrary to Caesar. After Constantine, and then I guess kind of looking at Augustine, maybe because he's just such a prolific writer who's got big impact on Christians later. Augustine, at least in practice, obviously doesn't see any major issue with Christians, participating in state functions. What do you think that underlying shift was for him in thinking that went from seeing these two systems as being so contrary to now suddenly, you can kind of do both and sort of thing?
Right. That's a great question. And that's where history matters, right? So Constantine comes to the throne as a single emperor, right? Divided in 305, 306, but as a single emperor in the summer of 224. Eventually, by his death in 337, he's close to his death, he's going to be baptized Christian. And again, religiosity is not about Jesus in your heart or Zeus in your heart. It's about how do you live your life. From Constantine all the way to Theodosius, in other words, the next 60 years, with the exception of Julian, Constantine's nephew. Julian is called the apostate because he espoused the classical gods again. Every other emperor is a Christian, but waits to be baptized until the end of their life. And then in 380, we have Theodosius. Theodosius, who comes to the throne, he's a Christian, devout, what we would call Catholic Orthodox Christian. He's a devout, creedal Christian who has not been baptized. He's a general. He does what he needs to do. And then he falls ill. And because everybody expects him to die, he's baptized at his deathbed. But he recovers.
Sorry, stop there and explain that real quick. Why were they all waiting, these emperors who espoused Christianity, why did they wait until the end of their lives to be baptized into the Christian church?
Because we affirm one baptism for the forgiveness of sin.
So the closer you can get it to the end, you got less time to sin then between.
That's right. Because post-baptismal sin is a big deal. It's not because they didn't take their Christianity seriously that they postponed baptism. It's because they took Christianity very seriously that they postponed their baptism.
Did they know they had a lot more sins to commit, or what?
Well, if you're a general, if you're a magistrate, if you're an emperor, guess what? Things are going to happen. Or things will need to be done.
You got to keep your options open.
You got to keep your options open. And they knew that if they took that step and were publicly baptized as Christians, they could not function that way. So Theodosius now is a Christian, right? So you cannot have an emperor who's Christian and, the empire not being Christian. So in the next few years, what happens, and I'll come to Augustine because that's very important. The empire is transformed through a series of edicts, imperial edicts, from Christianity recognized as a religion in the late 3rd century to Christian recognized as a preferable religion in the early 4th century to now in the late 4th century, within 60 years, Christianity being the imperial religion. And very, very quick order, within 15 years, Christianity being the only religion and paganism being outlawed. So Augustine is born in a part of history where Christianity is a preferable religion. And he enters ministry when Christianity is the only religion. So that is behind almost everything that he sees from that point on, right? Everyone is a Christian right now, right? From 390 on, everyone is a Christian. And from 399, everyone can only be a Christian. Do you see the difference? So who's the everyone? The baker on the street, right? The magistrate over there. But you know who else? The brothel keeper, the slave trader, right? You don't have options here. Everybody's a Christian. So when Augustine reflects on ministry or Christian engagement, he reflects out of that world, a world in which Christianity now is the only official religion of the empire.
Do you think if you could go back and talk to a Christian pre-Constantine, maybe an Origen or Tertullian, and describe to them the world of Augustine and say, hey, sometime in the future, the emperor will claim Christianity. Christianity won't be persecuted. In fact, it will be celebrated, almost standard within our culture. Do you think they would have imagined that as suddenly being okay then for them to be both Christian and, good Roman citizens? Or would they have said, oh, well, you still need to be distinct from this system of Rome?
Yeah. Actually, that would be like they would think you have been hallucinating. And on principle, not on practical aspects, right? Can the whole world be converted? Sure. But on principle, what's their principle? Origen has a section when he responds to Celsus, who's a pagan philosopher who writes against Christianity just a few years before Origen. He says, you Christians, what would happen to the empire if everyone behaved like you when the barbarians invaded? In other words, who would protect the borders? And Origen preempts that, thinks about that, and he says, what would happen if everyone was like us? The barbarians would be Christians too. And therefore, there would be no war.
So they perceived a method of, transforming the world that certainly did not require the state. And then do you think for Augustine, as he's writing, is it just that he doesn't imagine any way kind of outside of the state for that transformation to happen? Or is it just such an assumption for him that, this is how Christianity does and will function?
Augustine works for the first 2 decades of his episcopal career. He works with a counter church in North Africa, the Donatists. The Donatists are the pure church, the church of the Cathars, the pious people who have not been tainted by secularism or paganism. They have never succumbed to the state and all that. But they have become militant. If he had the term, he would call them nationalists. He didn't have that term. But that's the idea, right? We're the pure Christians. The rest of you all go to the same hell, whether you're pagans or, non-us. And that's where he has to deal with the reality of a counter church or a rival church in North Africa that is a militant church, right? It's violent church. It literally would wait in the dark corridors and beat up Catholic Christians. They would take over church buildings and all that. Augustine goes, how does a teacher behave? Okay, I'm a teacher, we don't do this, but back then, they had corporal punishment, right? So when you misbehave in the classroom, what does your teacher do? Well, takes the rod and beats you, he says. And it's City of God 19 and a couple of letters that he wrote on that. So Augustine thinks of violence pedagogically.
And state-sponsored violence pedagogically.
Right, because that's the only rod that can be effective, right? The rod is the state. So he calls upon the state to function out of love for those who are being lost, the Donatists, right? The schismatics, to bring them in. Is that his only option? No. But for his time in North Africa, it worked for him. So he ran with it. There's a great book coming out in the next year by Greg Lee. My colleague, Dr. Lee, has written on Augustine, especially on City of God 19, quite a bit on this. And Augustine has been, a lot of current study and scholarship on Augustine is showing clearly that Augustine has been misused for purposes that he would not have foreseen.
Coming into that world where, for Augustine, where everybody's Christian, you said, even the brothel keeper's Christian, does he not imagine a church that functions, or does he not imagine a Christianity that functions as a counterculture?
The analogy that he uses quite often is of the wheat and the tares out of the Gospels. No one knows what's hidden in the heart of a person. Only God knows what's in the heart of a person, including his own, Augustine's own heart. Right? So he refuses to pass judgment as he looks at his congregation, who actually is a Christian and who is not Christian. In whom is God working and in whom is God not working? Because the only one who knows is God. God is the only one who knows the secret parts of the heart. So if you extrapolate from that, how then am I going to pass judgment in my city on who behaves, who is a Christian, who's not a Christian? That doesn't make him a relativist, right? There are certain things that Christians do not do. But the society as a whole should be, and that's actually the latter parts of the City of God, which is Christianity has actually, he insists, moved the pendulum of the city, the lived out city, the capital C city, right? The state or our existence towards that heavenly city in which we're united with God. So he sees the two cities, the city of man and the city of God. For a period of time, they coexist. The city of man had priority up to Jesus, or supremacy up to Jesus. And then the city of God begins fervently with Jesus, who now establishes this new superimposed city on top of the other city, that is the city of God. Right? That's the perfect city.
So for Augustine, looking at, ethical teachings of Jesus, the love your enemy, the turn your cheek, does he see that as really an ethic for kind of that future where that city of God is, superimposed on the city of man?
He sees that as its full actualization, right? But even now, okay, we're keen, or many people are keen to say Augustine is a just war theorist, right? Well, I would argue he isn't, but okay. His concern is love for those who are lost. So his first principle is not proportionality or the right authority issuing war, right? His first principle is love of the other. That's the first principle. And actually, it's both first and last principle, right? Why do you do all this? So that you bring the other, in this case, the heretic, the schismatic, in communion with God and the church. Well, when you start moving into the extrapolation of just war as it comes in the Middle Ages and from there into the post-Enlightenment world that we live in the categories of just war, love of enemy is nowhere. If we begin with love of enemy as the principle, then our realities are very, very different.
When Luther writes on this, does he make some justification for war, claiming that you can go to war and even kill as an act of love? Is he circling back to ideas from Augustine when he makes that case?
Remember that Luther is an Augustinian monk, right? Mm-hmm. And he's also a very medieval Augustinian person. Luther is born, raised, ministers, and dies as a medieval man. He's not post-Reformation Enlightenment categories. So yes, he goes back into Augustine quite a bit. The question is the tradition that Luther has inherited out of Augustine, or the hermeneutic of Augustine he has inherited, actually fully accurate of Augustine's complex thought?
Yeah, there's a lot of time there.
There's a lot of
between
time
the two.
there. Yeah. But the basic principle here is, and yes, we especially in the West, we like Augustine, and we find a lot of value in spending time with him. But if we extract Augustine from the late 4th century and what has happened to the world, then he becomes just simply a principle or set of principles, rather than a living, breathing person who has just seen his world. Augustine went from a flat earth to a globe in his own lifetime. I mean, that kind of a change. The concept that everything belongs to Christ, right? That the cross will be over everything in state is unimaginable 2 generations earlier. It just doesn't exist.
So because of his specific time and place, it's almost unfair to ask him to have a different perspective on the state and use of state, even violence, in order to uphold like Christian principles or Christian ethics. It's almost impossible to ask him to remove himself from what he's seen in his life, which to his eyes is Christianity has taken over the entire known world. All the powers of the world have been subsumed under the name of Christ.
That's right. Eusebius, just a few generations earlier in the ecclesiastical history, the last 2 books, see this period as the millennial kingdom.
Isn't Constantine sometimes spoken of as like the second coming of Christ?
Exactly. That's exactly it. Jesus comes back in persona Constantine, in the person of Constantine.
Yeah.
So the kingdom is here. It's a different kind of eschatology. But think about a community or communities where they are, by that time, the end of the 3rd, beginning of the 4th century, substantial minorities, upper 20s, low 30s% of the population. Christianity was never plurality of the culture around them, who still having living memory persons who were tortured for their faith. And suddenly the emperor goes, no, we're Christians now.
Sure.
I mean, it's just unimaginable.
As fascinating as that is, do you think, in your assessment, was this a theological mistake for Christians? Like, let's just say like Augustine. Let's not be too harsh on him because of his situatedness and his time and place. But was it a theological mistake to assume that because Christianity now has prominence and is now favored by the worldly empire, therefore it can sort of be wed with the worldly empire, or we can use the worldly empire to advance Christian-ish principles? Was that a theological mistake that the Christian church made, or is that an unfair question?
No, it's absolutely the question to ask. And many of us call this the Constantinian captivity of the church. That it's always better practically, or experientially, it's always more desirable to be not persecuted than being persecuted. It's a little bit natural.
It's an easy choice, yeah.
It's an easy choice. But at what cost? Because now I have to proclaim Caesar is Lord. And remember, up to now, I refused because there were the gods of the pagans who were superintending our experience. But now those are, poof, gone. So in the standard of religion, instead of having the standard or the eagle or the standard of this god or that god, now I have a cross.
Yeah, the Cairo or whatever.
Yeah. So what changed, right? So because the world was moving ahead quite fast at that time, it's the same question that we need to ask in the 20th century before we come to the 21st, where we are. Industrialization, urbanization, suburbanization, nuclear power, this, that, and the other. Yes, but can we take a pause and see, are we actually applying Christianly what is in our power and our grasp? We bypass it, but what do you do with a brothel keeper who's now a Christian? What do you do with him?
You tell us. You're the professors.
Well, but that's a question. The question, right? And that is where the church struggled, and I think had a lot of wisdom in the 4th century. Because the church order documents, a lot of documents that have come to us from various parts of the empire, where Christians ask practical questions, right? What do I need to do to become a Christian, right? How do I get ready for baptism? who can be ordained and how, like all those church order matters. Univocally say up to this time, including this time of transition, if somebody comes to be baptized, ask them these questions, right? And if they're a brothel keeper, they should stop being one. If they're a teacher of pagan philosophy, they should stop being one. If they're a gladiator, stop being one. If they have a whole catalog of these things that presuppose a world that now needs to be run differently. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the question then is, okay, so the brothel keeper is going to stop. What happens to the women and men or boys and girls who are serving as slaves in the brothel? What do you do with them? Like, what do they eat tonight? Where do they sleep tonight?
Yeah.
Right? And that's where the church intervened and took care of those in need in that transitional period. We have monasteries and we have church-affiliated other training programs, and we have orphanages where they took everybody because they understood if you close the brothel down, as you should, then it has social consequence, right? And part of those lists is if somebody comes to be baptized and is getting ready to enter the military service, tell them to stop and choose, because you cannot do both. If somebody becomes a Christian while in military service, tell them to get out of it if they can, or the alternative was to refuse an order to kill.
That seems like kind of a death sentence on oneself if you're a centurion.
Yeah, not just centurion. And we have numbers of accounts, and I have included them in the book, called the military martyrs. Accounts of primarily officers, but not always officers, of persons who either refused to be drafted and were executed, or while in the service, and we have Macrin's and we have others, who come to the realization, wait a minute, I've been doing this for 20 years, but I never thought about it. Now that I think about it, and usually it's because a pagan says, hey, wait a minute, you're a Christian, you cannot be doing this. Mm-hmm. They go, oh, yeah, you're right, I cannot be doing this. And they're all executed. Being a Christian has consequence.
This is something that happened before 380 Common Era, though, right? Before Theodosius. Yeah. After Theodosius, though, didn't you have a lot of Christians that are more or less okay or justified being involved with military service in the empire?
Because the whole empire now, everyone is Christian.
And the standard at the front of your army is not, I don't know, not some pagan god, it's Christ, right? It's the cross or something like that. And so it's easy to kind of wed those two. So this is a question that you probably get a lot, but I just think it's interesting to think about into the 20th century, or 18th, 19th, 20th century, and on into today. You know, sometimes people want to just simply overlap, like the country we live in right now, with the Roman Empire, talk about them as the same thing. We should have more or less the same attitude. And I'm sure there is overlap, but could you describe kind of the differences between the United States, where we are, and the Roman Empire that would potentially justify Christians' participation in like a United States military context? What's that line of reasoning? What's that perspective? I guess steelman that argument for us.
Yeah. I would say one of the biggest differences, remember, the Roman Empire is a 1,000-year-old empire, right?
Yes, yes.
We're just in infancy. We're babies.
Yeah, right.
Conceptually, we're not all that different. We are supposed to be a melting pot under the superintendence of vague deity, that Judeo-Christian, tradition that nobody ever defines.
One nation under some god.
Yeah, some god.
Whatever you think of as God, just
whatever you think of as God, that's that one. Well, that's not unlike the Roman world, right? Tolerant. As long as you accept everybody else, we're good. Powerful, right? For its environment, for its topography, unchallenged power. Not for a generation or two, for 1,000 years. I mean, let that sink in for a moment. For 1,000 years, right? Given to pretty much the same concept of social structure as we do. We don't have slaves as they did, and their slavery is different than our tradition of or history of slavery in the United States. theirs was not racially based. It was ethnic or national or war or poverty. But when you start digging deeper, think about slavery, in modern day slavery, right? From itinerant day workers to cycles of poverty, right? Not all that different. A slathering of religiosity that, what happens when the national anthem is being played? You stand up, you put your arm over your heart, and you pledge allegiance to a piece of fabric. But it's more the idea, the concept that nobody can actually put their hand on it. Like you cannot put your finger on that, but it's there.
Just to highlight this for a second, I think people today, we tend to think of, U.S. as a much more secular nation. But I think what you're getting at here is that a lot of the things that Rome did to maintain unity, we have similar systems that are in place today, although we certainly don't think of them as being, a secularization of our state or as, religious practices in any way, but they can function very similarly.
That's right. And the reason why we don't realize what we do is because we have this illusion that there's a difference between religious or organized religion and civil religion. Our structure is civil religion. Everyone who has gone through schools, primary and secondary education here in the US, right? First thing you do in the morning, you get up and you stand up, put your hand over your heart, and you recite a creed or a pledge of allegiance, right? And after 12 years of that, we go into the football game and somebody refuses to do that. And you go, wait a minute, something happened. Something's off here.
Yeah, because everyone else has been trained, has been discipled, and religious people have too. So people have different backgrounds, but maybe the idea of separation of church and state has actually made room for us to kind of live duplicitous allegiances. Or on Sunday morning, we'll say, Yahweh is Lord, Jesus is Lord. And on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday in school or football games, we'll say, I pledge allegiance to the United States of America, not to Jesus per se.
That's right. And then you start moving, right? As Christians, we start moving and say, okay, so Christianity, what's the basis of Christianity? Jesus, yeah, okay. And who is to be a follower of Jesus or part of this family? Everyone. Yeah. There's no Jew and Gentile, right?
Yeah, all who call on the name of the Lord, yeah.
All who come, okay. Who's all? Belgians too? The Dutch, right? I mean, you keep on going down the list and you go, yes, Christianity is a transnational, transbordered family, okay? We here, because of accident of history, we're currently here, pledge allegiance to a topography or to a structure localized. What does that mean for my relationship with my Canadian brothers and sisters? Which one is superior to the other?
Yeah, there's certainly a potential conflict there, and sometimes it's not just potential. In wartime, when nations go against each other, now what happens? Because it's not a potential conflict, it is a conflict of allegiances at that moment. You kind of have to decide how you're going to posture in that moment. How are you going to identify in that moment? And that happens all the time. I could bring up examples right now. I'm smart enough not to say it out loud, but we might be thinking of some similar things going on in the world right now. So.
Well, I'm not that smart, so I'm going to mention a few, right? Because I also work with refugees with the International Association for Refugees. And I just came from the sub-Saharan refugee camp just a few weeks ago. How do we treat refugees or persons seeking refuge because of internal war, external war, whatever it is, if they are Christian, white, blue-eyed, and blonde, versus brown or black, even though both groups are Christians, right? So many Syrian Christians sought refuge, and we said no. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi Christians sought refuge, and we said no, right? Palestinian Christians seek refuge, and we say no, right? So which one is higher allegiance for me? Is it my baptismal allegiance, or is it my secular allegiance?
Why do you think, for so many Christians looking at, politics or whatever issue they're looking at out in the world today, why is it so easy not to see where those two allegiances should be in conflict?
Because as we said before, it's far more desirable to not be persecuted than to be persecuted. I know it's divisive, but just for mental exercise, right? Think about Colin Kaepernick. What happened to him? Ponder what happens to those who, for whatever reason, take a stance against the popular or dominant paradigm. Right?
Sure.
And you look at that and you go, I have a family to feed. I cannot do that. So I'm not going to do that. The bigger problem for me is when we fail to recognize that in North America, in the United States, our military is a volunteer force. It means I chose to do that, right? I wasn't drafted into this. I wasn't forced into this. I chose to do this. I chose to stand and put my hand or raise my hand and take an oath of allegiance and say, I will follow your orders.
Even if I have to carry something out against my brothers and sisters in King Jesus.
Think of the example, everybody knows the example of Christmas Day, the truce between Allied forces and the German troops. Everybody singing, Holy Night together. What happened the week after? German Christians, Allied Christians, right? On that day, they sang about the Prince of Peace. And the week after, one of the bloodiest periods of the war up to that time.
They went back to their allegiance to their civil religion.
That's right. Think of Strasbourg, the famous city of Strasbourg, right? Currently in France. Used to be in Germany. Used to be in France. Used to be in Germany. To the point where Mother Strasbourg has in her arms as a pietas the bodies of her two sons, French uniform, German uniform, right? So that shows the arbitrariness of borders. A city that can swing for generations back and forth between. And now you're going to call your sons and daughters, your sons, to kill each other because 2 weeks earlier somebody redrew the line. You go, and nobody says this is madness. This cannot happen in the name of Jesus.
So a few minutes ago, well, quite a few minutes ago now, I actually asked you to steelman the other side. So steelman why the United States is so different from the Roman Empire that we as Christians could voluntarily take an oath of allegiance to the state, to be a part of the military, to carry out orders even against other brothers and sisters in Christ across in foreign lands or on our own. Steelman that position. Help me to understand that the differences are so big between the United States and Rome that we could possibly get there.
I don't know how provocative one wants to be, but I'll say what
Go for it.
Because our Christianity is cultural Christianity. It's not real Christianity. Real Christianity evokes a response. And the response it evokes from those in power, and it doesn't mean just government. It means social power, economic power, political power, whatever, is the same that the response was towards Jesus. When you ask Jesus, why did you come? He gives you the answer. It's in Luke 4, right? I came to what? To heal the blind, to set the prisoner free, to set the oppressed free, right? And we say, not so fast.
Yeah, that sounds like social justice.
Yeah, we of course forget that the prisoner and the oppressed at the time of Jesus was economic oppression, right? Prisoner is not because you killed somebody, they execute you for that. Is debtors' prisons, which was the vast majority of incarceration up to our time. So we don't think about Christianity as economic justice. We don't think of Christianity as environmental justice, national justice, gender justice, ethnic justice. We think of Christianity as an escapism. I'm not going to hell. I'm going to the good place. I'm good. That's the Christianity we have preached. So what do you do with the brothels in our time? You actually keep them. That's the difference. The difference is that for us, being Christian carries no consequence. And therefore, the world does not see in us Jesus.
When early Christians talk about suffering, they talk about that as an opportunity to proclaim the gospel of Jesus. Is that the context they're seeing that in? That they are now going to stand against that civil religion of their day and seek to bring about that same work that Jesus began and will return to finish?
That's right. Think about the imitatio Christi, imitation of Christ, right? What does Christian mean? The word Christianos, Christian, means little Christ, right? Like when you see the statue of the emperor, you see the emperor himself. That's how they understood. Like the emperor is present when the image, the icon of the emperor is present. And the adversaries looked at these people and said, "You look like Jesus." And they go, "Ooh, we like that. Yes, we do. You mean it for evil, but we take it for good, right? We don't look like Jesus. Because if we looked like Jesus, the world would realize that it is not good. But what they see when they see us, they don't see Christ. Because if they saw Christ among us, there would be no poor. There would be no orphans. There would be no widows. There would be no marginalized. There would be no one who's being refused refuge, right? We keep on quoting in our time Leviticus, the first part of 17, 18, and 19. And then we forget what's the latter part of 19, beginning with 30 to 34, right? You will take those who seek refuge, the sojourner in. You will take the foreigner to be like you in your land. We don't want to do that.
It's costly for us. I mean, it's obviously a time commitment, but it's also a resource commitment as well. Our institutions don't want to take that on. And personally, I mean, we, the individuals, are the ones who make up those institutions, and none of us want to take that on personally. So we would like a religion that we go to church on Sunday and sing the songs and hear a message, and even hear a message sometimes that makes us feel really convicted. And then we would like to go about our lives and build the American dream and pledge allegiance to who knows when.
But that's so well put. Because even for Christians, for those who claim to be Christians in the U.S. or in our world, what is the purpose? What's the dream? What's success? The American dream, not the Christian dream. Those are two different things.
Yeah. When you interact with Christians, how do you help encourage them to go from kind of wherever they're at to understanding that need to be willing to suffer for standing against the civil, religion of our day?
I don't talk much about suffering. I begin with an experiment, with a question. Everybody wants to play a game. It takes about 10 seconds to play. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and paint a picture. You don't need to tell me, but paint a picture. If you project 10, 15 years down the road, what does success look like for you? Not happiness, but success look like. And everyone is able to do that, right? Everyone has a picture of what success looks like. And then the question is, so who gave you that image? Who painted that picture of success for you? Was it school, the family, community, church, the mall, Hollywood, or was it Jesus? One allows time for the interlocutor to think it through. And the question is, am I willing to suffer? That's not for me, not the right question. The right question is, am I willing to be like Jesus? Now, how the world responds to me for being like Jesus, that's a secondary, tertiary question. But the primary question is, am I willing to look, act, be in the image of Christ? If not, we'll still have coffee together after church and, eat donuts. But that's not what church is about. Church is the gathering of the people whom God has made into his image to be for the world the image of God.
Yeah, to be Christ in the world.
Be Christ in the world.
Jesus obviously spoke in that way before he ascended to the Father, that he would, even greater things than he was doing, the church would do by the help of the Spirit whom he would send.
And we see throughout the New Testament, throughout the book of Acts, the New Testament, right? We see people not being afraid to die. We don't seek death, but we're not afraid of it. Why? Because we believe in the resurrection.
Right now, yeah.
But modern Christians don't believe in the resurrection, and therefore we live our lives in fear.
Oh, maybe we definitely affirm that we believe in the resurrection. Is your contention that we practically, by the way we live, demonstrate that we don't actually have that much of a hope in the resurrection? That's exactly what I mean. Yeah. Are we going to let him go on this?
I don't know. It's a heavy spot.
I haven't had you answer my question yet, Dr. Kalantzis. I keep pressing you on this military service thing in the modern landscape right now. I got to get your opinion on it.
The reason why we can see a way around the clear prescriptions in order to be part of the military is because we're actually not Christian.
Ouch. That hurts deep.
So, think about how much time we need to think through and find a way to weave our way to an answer that says, yep, they're compatible. It shouldn't be that hard. If it takes all that energy to figure out how am I allowed to do this, that ought to tell you something about the question itself, right? If you need 4 treatises and 3 books to figure out, so am I allowed to do that? I mean, come on. It should not be that hard.
Well, we appreciate your candor, and we thank you for giving us your honest opinions. That's why we had you on. We knew you'd give us your honest opinions, so we appreciate it. We appreciate your very well-informed opinions as well. We've appreciated your scholarly work on this. Again, plug the book, Caesar and the Lamb. You said there's a 2nd edition coming out soon?
Yes, within the year, it should be out. By the fall, it should be out.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Dr. Kalantzis, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.